Today we're going to continue our discussion of the underground cities. Going to use a few of the source materials that we used in the conversation that Dan Lowe and I had a while back on underground cities in the Americas. And today I want to discuss some of the documents that we have this information, source information from. The first document I want to start with is I'm going to read from the computer about a man by the name of Tevis and his account with an Apache Indian who was a tribal leader. And I'm going to pull that up on the internet and then read that. The Apaches say that at one time they were a great war tribe, but that a great army invaded their country with such terrible war implements that their people were killed before their arrows could reach the enemy. When it came to a hand-to-hand fight, the enemy used broad-bladed hatchets with deadly effect. And when the Apaches would lunge at the invaders, who wore shields, their lances would break. And so it seemed to the Apaches that the lives of their opponents were charmed. Even though the Apaches numbered 20 to 1, the enemy was successful in every engagement and kept driving them north. Behind this vast army came a great number of people in charge of priests. They settled all along the watercourses, building forts and churches. In the mountains they also built furnaces and melted the rocks like water. Finally, the Apaches had to succumb to the tyranny of the invaders, and they were no better than slaves, for warriors, squaws, and children all worked for them. Northwest of Apache Pass, about 10 days' journey, lay a valley somewhat like a tableland, many miles in length and very wide, with a fine stream of water and an abundance of timber. Here a large city was founded. Pack trains of hundreds of animals would come and go every few days. This went on for years, and the Apaches became more burdened until secretly they began planning their release from such tyranny. At last, when preparations were completed, they began a battle and massacred all but those in Montezuma City, the stronghold of the hostile commander. All of the enemy coming and going to the city were killed. And this is Tevis talking. He said, "I asked old Esconolea if this great army came from that portion of the coast where Guaymas is situated. But he said no, that they landed a great many miles further west, but came through what country now known as the Yaqui country. There were sufficient Indians to guard the entire country, and also to closely surround the great city. They put a check on all farming and drove the enemy's stock away. The city held out for about a year after the uprising, until nearly all were starved to death. The remaining few were easily captured, and so from then on to the time of Esconolea's story, the Apaches were sole occupants of the vanquished enemy's ground. I told Esconolea that I did not think such an account was to be found in history, and he asked me what history was, and how old my country was. He laughed. Then he asked, 'How does your history say about your people taking this country from us?' I'm going to tell you what my father told me that his father had told him." "All right," said I. "There are old churches yet today in New Mexico and Old Mexico which are over 300 years old. So there must be something left to designate such a city as you describe. I would like to go and see it." He consented to take me, so a few days afterwards we started for Montezuma City. Our course led us in the direction which I have described before, and our journey lasted about 10 days. In making our trip to the ruins, we camped at the foot of a large mountain near a magnificent spring which ran into a little valley, where there was an old aquila, a primitive form of irrigation ditch, which had been used to carry water out over the valley from the spring. Esconolea told me that the mountain ahead of us was the last we would have to climb, and just over the top lay Montezuma City. Early the next morning we started out in our climb, which proved to be very hard for the first 3 hours. Through a thick growth of pines we climbed until we came upon an old trail, which ascended more gradually than the course we had just finished. We arrived at the top of the mountain at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The view from the summit, just as old Esconolea had said, overlooked the valley with a stream running through it. And there, just a short distance into the valley, lay Montezuma City. Thrilled by adventure, I was eager to reach this spot. After we had ridden about a mile, we began to pass great numbers of mounds of various sizes, which lasted until we reached the stream where we camped. Large herds of elk and deer could be seen on either side, and wild turkeys were everywhere. The stream was filled with mountain trout. And here we spent 2 days riding over the valley, examining mounds which extended for miles on both sides of the stream. The courses of the Aquillas were quite discernible. Esconolea took me to a very large mound where he said the commander had lived. And we went around the old crumbled walls. We found old pottery and copper implements and some articles which resembled helmets and breastplates. While I examined these things, old Esconolea watched me very intently and said, "Tonuga," or "What is the name of it?" I explained to him why their arrows and lances had no effect upon the invaders of their country. I told him that it was a metal covering which even the balls of a rifle could not penetrate, much less arrows. Inside these ruins were signs everywhere of a once prosperous city. If these ancient ruins were not the ones described to me by Esconolea, then what could they have been? It was certainly one of the loveliest valleys I had ever seen, and nature had provided food for a lifetime within easy reach. I asked old Esconolea why his tribe did not live here. With great surprise he answered, "Fudakaskatil," or "God Almighty's blood. This is sacred ground. The same is Canon de Lopez. The Great Spirit forbids our living in it." A low place on the top of a large range of mountains about 8 to 10 miles wide extended east and west as far as the eye could see. On the other side of this, old Esconolea told me we would find a mountain as large as that we had climbed, going into Montezuma. I judged from the distance we had traveled, it was between 300 and 400 miles northwest of what is now Tevis, and that it must lie east of the Colorado River, for old Esconolea told me that the waters running through Montezuma City entered the Tuitza, or large waters, meaning the Colorado. At this time he described the Grand Canyon of the Colorado, and he called it Tarus-tu-Shudu, or Bad Mountains. And he said the mountains on either side of the river were perpendicular. The river had cut its way through the Bad Mountains, and frequently he had heard his people say that the invaders had an underground passage through the Grand Canyon. This, he said, I have never found. Let me repeat that. Frequently he had heard his people say that the invaders had an underground passage through the Grand Canyon. To this, he said, I have never found. On our return home, we took the same trail, but did not turn off at the thicket of pines. On the east side, we could see old shafts made by the Jesuits, and a few miles further from this point, where we had entered the valley, were the remains of an old reduction works. Each day as we traveled, we continued to pass old abandoned shafts. The last ones were between the San Francisco and Gila rivers, about 12 miles from the point where the San Francisco enters the Gila. Okay, I know I need to work on my Spanish pronunciations, but what we can gather from this is that Tevis, and old Esconolea, the Apache, traveled to what they called Montezuma City, an ancient city where there were many large mounds left, and it was close to the Colorado River in a long valley, and it was rumored, Esconolea was saying, that his people had told him there was an underground passage that led underneath the Grand Canyon, underneath the Colorado River from one side to the other. Now this may sound like a tall tale or an impossibility, but wait until you hear from modern history what was found in this same general area many years later. Okay, I'm reading this from Wikipedia. This is about the Grand Canyon Caverns. Anybody can get on the internet and read this information. It says the Grand Canyon Caverns, Havasupai, pronounce the name of the Indian tribes, pronounced the Wallapai, is located just a few miles east of Peach Springs, Arizona. These caverns lie 210 feet below ground level. They are among the largest dry caverns in the United States. Dry caverns compose only 3% of caverns in the world. Because of the lack of water, stalagmites and stalactites are rare in the caverns. Air comes into the caverns from the Grand Canyon through 60 miles of limestone caves. A fact discovered when red smoke flares were ignited in the caves, and 2 weeks later, red smoke was seen protruding from vents in the Grand Canyon. It goes on to say that they were produced during the Mississippian period. It was created in a limestone deposit, which was, the bedrock was lifted up to over 5,000 feet above sea level. And then it said rainwater flowed into the rock, eroded passages that lead to the Colorado River and what is now the Grand Canyon. The evaporating water left calcium deposits on the walls and floors, creating the formation that can be viewed today. Talks about some of the TV shows that the caverns have been featured in. Some of the contemporary history. So in 1927, cowboy and woodcutter Walter Peck was walking through the area on his way to play poker with his friends when he stumbled and nearly fell into a hole. Peck and some of his friends returned the next day to the large funnel-shaped hole with lanterns and ropes. With a rope tied around his waist, he was lowered into the hole to a depth of 150 feet and began exploring. Speckles on the walls led Peck to believe he had discovered a gold mine. He gathered samples of the shiny rock and had his friends pull him back to the surface. Goes on to talk about how while he was in the caverns that he discovered 2 bodies which he called cavemen, but were found to be the remains of 2 Wallapai Indians. And the story goes that these men had died in the winter of 1917 and 1918. That they were out harvesting firewood from the hilltop near the cavern, and they were trapped for 3 days by a snowstorm. 2 of the Indians had died from exposure, perhaps influenza, and since the ground was frozen solid and covered in snow, the men were placed into the 50-foot hole. It says that in 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps and Work Progress Administration made an agreement with Peck to build a new entrance to the caverns. In 1962, another entrance was built by blasting a 210-foot shaft into the limestone and installing a large elevator. At that time, the natural entrance was also sealed off at the request of the Wallapai Indians, as it was considered a sacred burial place. Near the natural entrance, the skeletal remains of a giant sloth, I'm not going to even try to pronounce that in Latin, the giant and extinct ground sloth lived during the age of mammals, when the woolly mammoth and saber-toothed tiger roamed North America. And it goes on to say that this sloth skeleton was about 15 feet tall, and they estimated that it weighed over 2,000 pounds. There's a lot of really interesting information in here. I guess the most interesting thing that I want to point out, that the caverns lie within an alluvial plain at an altitude at about 5,300 feet. They're in a limestone subsurfaced area which is riddled with numerous caverns that run for miles in all directions. During the 1950s, scientists began searching for the source of fresh air encountered in the cavern's depths. Engineers set off red flares in the Snowball Cavern room, and once it dissipated, they searched for many days in the surrounding country for signs of seepage to the Earth's surface. In a few weeks, rangers who worked at the Grand Canyon National Park reported seeing red smoke seeping from the rocks in the canyon walls nearly 63 miles to the north of the caverns. And so, in other words, you have 63 miles of caverns near this Grand Canyon. In another source that you can read online, they did some seismographing beneath the known cavern wall, or the known cavern rooms. One of these rooms is so big that an entire football stadium or entire football field could be enclosed in the cavern. That's how big it is. They said when they seismographed, they detected two large rooms 1,500 feet below these known caverns. But they said unless there's a natural passage route, they can find a natural passage route to these caverns, the exploration is probably too expensive of an undertaking. So, whether or not the traditions that the Aztecs have of coming to the Grand Canyon and placing treasure in a large cavern, or whether these other things we've talked about in this series are accurate or not, we know from this example here that there are underground caverns that go for miles and miles in the Grand Canyon region. And in my opinion, this gives a lot of credibility to the other stories of an underground city in the Grand Canyon.